Thank you, Samana. Mosques are coming up. They have doubled since 9/11. So Muslims are busy doing something. But there is, each time a mosque comes up, there is a fight which comes up with it. And someone I have noticed that, and that is a staff writer and podcast host and a producer at Slate Magazine. With us is Aymann Ismail. Welcome to Muslim Network, Ismail.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much. Tell us, what is this mosque war which you are written about? There is one war or multiple wars there?
There are multiple wars. So, in the United States, after 9/11, the Muslim community here faced a plethora of different politicians and TV pundits trying to theorize about who Muslims are and what they believe. And of course, they did this without actually inviting Muslims in, and that led to a lot of misinformation, a lot of bigoted sentiments, racist sentiments taking hold in a very large percent of the American society. And so, as a result, it seems quite obvious that when people are learning that there are mosques being constructed in their backyard or being expanded, they might assign some of those misconceptions to those communities without actually having to know anyone from that community or any evidence of any ill will or terrorism or anything like that. So, as a result, when a new mosque was being announced or constructed, they would face a backlash. And sometimes it was violent, where they would face vandalism, hate crimes. People would leave pieces of raw bacon, and in other ways that they would try to resist is they would file lawsuits and petitions against the local government to do something about this, and they would say that it posed a threat to their society. And there are countless examples for this, but in my piece in Slate Magazine, which published last week, I focused on one example in Tennessee, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And I spent about 2 hours on the phone with the imam who chronicled his experience with doing what he thought was a very simple and simple to understand. He just needed to build a larger mosque for his growing Muslim community. Now, in Murfreesboro, it's a little bit of a rural area. And so, in many cases, the community wasn't interacting with the rest of the society on a daily basis. And so many of these people were relying on some of these bigoted ideas that they had for what Muslims were going to be doing inside these mosques. But this imam, his name was Dr. Osama Balur, he had a really brilliant approach. He left the doors open. He would walk through the protests where people were holding signs saying that this was going to be a terrorist training camp and that they were never going to allow this mosque. He left the door unlocked and asked people to come inside and see things for themselves. As a result, people would sometimes engage, but for the most part, it didn't really change anyone's mind. A lot of Americans that he interacted with had their feet planted, but it did give him a very valuable learning experience as to how to engage in certain ways with people who aren't willing to let open their hearts to Muslims.
Hmm. In Muslim Network TV reported yesterday, actually, that over the long weekend when people were mourning about what happened on 9/11, there were three mosques which were attacked. And of course, their favorite attack, one of the bleeding head of a pig, was also thrown. So these things didn't happen just after 9/11, or they continue to happen, but were there cases like this before 9/11?
Yeah, there were some cases, but obviously it spiked. In another piece that I did for Slate Magazine that released the day before the Mosque Wars one, I spoke to Nihed Awed. He's the co-founder and the executive director for CARE National, the Council of American Islamic Relations. And so he started the CARE in 1996, I believe. It might be 1994, but I'm pretty sure it's 1996. Obviously, this is several years before 9/11. But he basically told me that during the Oklahoma City bombing, which was not an Islamic terrorist attack at all, people still reacted to it as if it was. And they believed for a time, until more details came out, that it was Muslim terrorists who blew up the Oklahoma City hotel and killed many, many people. And so there was a backlash there against Muslims that he and his organization were actively trying to fight against. And part of that fight was to make themselves available to media networks so that they can have Muslims who they can talk to answer questions about Islam as it relates to things like violence and terrorism. And also, they were sending out condemnations for the terrorist attacks because when one of the common questions that people would ask during that time, this is before 9/11 and it continued after 9/11, is where are the peaceful Muslims and why aren't they condemning the attacks? So part of the responsibility for CARE was to send out these condemnations to every media organization so that they can right then have the answer to that question.
More the statement of condemnation you send out, more the Islamophobe ask, hey, why Muslims don't condemn? Because, issuing a statement is one thing, listening to a statement is another thing. I remember there was a girl in Arizona who, when her class fellow asked why Muslims don't condemn, she sat down all night and gathered about 800 pages worth of condemnation statements for her. Now, but you mentioned Oklahoma. By the way, that was essentially a government building, not a hotel. Now, ACLU keeps these statistics, and they have a map which you have linked in your article. I went there and I checked Chicago. The major fight in Chicago now is Islamic center of Naperville. And, for 2, 3 years, they're constantly trying to compromise and things like that. And it was not even mentioned. So do you think that, it's a case that it has come in Chicago Tribune and media and a whole lot of people are involved. Do you think mosque attacks and difficulty in building mosques are essentially underreported?
It's possible. One of the consequences of the ways that the police department villainized the Muslim communities, that the Muslim community, as a result, was far less likely to call the police when they needed the police's help to conduct an investigation or even just file a police report. And so, as a result, and I know people in my life, well, that this has happened to, where they might be assaulted or somebody will say something to them like, get out of my country, or they'll throw something at them and they won't call anybody. They'll just sort of walk it off and pretend it didn't happen. Now, this happened to me many times. I was in New York when a person made their hand into a gun and told me to go back to Iraq. I wasn't going to call the police, but that is a hate crime. And they were assigning something to me that does hurt and it does have like a lasting impression. But at the same time, it's impossible. It's impossible to look at the numbers as they are and imagine that those are all of the numbers. And you also have to remember that in America, the barrier for what gets reported as a hate crime or just a regular dispute is very, very high. Now, we can remember the story about the 3 students, the medical students who were killed, and they called it a parking dispute. But it became very obvious later on when there were messages and leaked information over the perpetrator, the person who killed these 3 students, that he had a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment that he'd been consuming online, and he expressed previously to killing them. And so Muslims might see this and think to themselves, okay, well, this person obviously hated Muslims, but at the same time, that never got reported as a hate crime. So it's very, very difficult to clear that barrier for Muslims for some reason.
But that case of 3 young people murdered, a couple of them students, was still not recorded as a hate crime, was it?
It was never recorded as a hate crime.
Okay. Now, so the mosque, going back to the discussion about mosque, you mentioned there are Christian groups which campaign against that. Who are these Christian groups who are campaigning against building of mosques?
So there were a handful of one, but one of the largest evangelical preachers in America went on the record and said that this was not a religious institution and that America needed to resist this, right? Now, this is something that to us, we see very often and we hear from politicians, but this is America's number one televangelicals. And what a evangelical is they basically have their church on TV. And so their reach is in the millions. And he was actively saying that this mosque was not a mosque, and it was a political project. And they were going to be here to basically, I think the quote was, he was there to take over the city councils, right? So that's extremely problematic because it essentially pits one religion against the other. When in America, as religious institutions, we really need to stick with each other because it's not just one nation under one specific God, it's one nation under God. And in order for us to actually practice religious freedom, we need to protect the rights of other religious minorities. You know what I'm trying to say? So it's within our interest to stick together and protect each other. And that's what I think was most shocking. And when I talked to the Imam, Osama Belul, he told me how there were Christian groups holding signs basically condemning people to hell. And that really troubled him because he was talking specifically about a 9-year-old who asked him, "Why do these people hate us?" And he's a religious leader and a spiritual leader, and of course, the accusation that we're going to be going to hell is extremely troubling. And so he had to explain to this 9-year-old why these people might feel this way or why they might be saying things like this to them. And that was extremely troubling for him.
While some of those people, tele-evangelical people, are opposing mosques, there must be other Christian groups who are standing by Muslims in their right to have freedom of religion.
Of course there are, right? And Jewish groups and Sikh groups. It's not just Christians who are standing with the Muslims, and also atheist groups. The support for Muslims, especially when it comes to building mosques, has been much larger than the opposition. But what makes the opposition so potent is that they often are able to crowdsource funding to actually bring lawsuits against the local government to petition against these mosques. And that's what happened to the Murfreesboro case, where the imam didn't have an emergency fund. He didn't have a lawyer on retainer. I mean, why would a mosque really need one up until this point? But he needed to then ask for a religious group. It's called the Beckett Fund to represent him pro bono, and they did represent him pro bono, and they were able to get all of the lawsuits that were leveled against the religious institution that they were trying to build thrown out. And then in response, they tried to bring it to a higher jurisdiction. They wanted to bring the court to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially said that this was not even worth their time and they weren't going to make a ruling on this at all, and rejected the appeal. And so the Constitution, in this sense, did what it was supposed to do, thanks in part to the Beckett Fund, who is not a Muslim organization, but just a religious freedom law organization. And Osama had a lot of praise for those people, because what they essentially did was they put the American Constitution on trial. He pulled it away from the argument that the anti-mosque builders wanted to have. They wanted to basically litigate whether or not Islam was a religion. But what the Beckett Fund did was they put the Constitution on trial and saying, well, how can we say that we have religious freedom and religious plurality in this country when we're not going to afford one religious group rights that another religious group does? And so it was on the burden of the country to prove to itself that it does build mosques at the same rate and at the same purpose for churches or synagogues or temples. And when the case did get litigated, it was completely thrown out and found to be obviously just racist.
Aymann, tell me this. Pew did a survey in March 2002, that is 5-6 months from the 9/11. There were 25% of America who has negative opinion of Islam. But now, just last month, they did a survey. Now 50% of Americans have negative opinion of Islam and Muslims. Do you think these wars on mosque in each city contribute to that type of negativity? So overall opinion of our neighbors towards Islam and Muslim has doubled since 9/11.
Of course, of course. One of the biggest problems, I think, that we have as a society is this desire to try and portray racism as something that you can be seen from both sides. Now, one of the mistakes, and this became most apparent during the opposition to the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which was neither at Ground Zero nor a mosque, but the opposition really put the media in this position where they had to litigate it themselves. But rather than look outside the window and report whether or not something is true or not, they opted to invite some of the worst bigots onto their programming so that they can argue that Islam was not a religion and didn't deserve rights. Now, people like Pamela Geller, David Urashami, Wesley Pipes, all of these people who have, who are for the most part these fringe characters who are extremely racist, and most people observe as just extremely racist, were now being given soapboxes on CNN, on ABC, on NBC, on Fox News. Every major program had to have these people over for some reason to argue that Islam was not a real religion or that it was a violent philosophy, which is insane. And it's not, it doesn't hold up to journalistic rigor when you think of just what the rules of journalism are. You don't invite racists to make the points for racism. It's just not how it should work. But that's what happened. And as a result, we've seen the explosion of a huge anti-Muslim cottage industry where people have been making millions of dollars off of books and off of think tanks and basically pretending to have the truth that the other media organizations are too afraid to tell. And of course, they do this without actually talking to any Muslim experts or without even researching the Quran with an open heart. Instead, they cherry pick certain things to deceive their audience into thinking that this religion, this beautiful religion that I worship and you do as well, into this insane um, uh, evil monster that's hiding under your bed. What they've done to our religion is incredibly dramatic. But as a result, you've seen a rise in Islamophobic sentiment because what they do is they get their integrity and they look like they're official because they have interviews with people on TV and on Fox News and they're wearing their suits and they're in the studio, but then they're selling these lies and they've made millions of dollars off people gullible enough to believe those lies.
Thank you so much, Aymann Ismail, for your
Thank
time.
you for having me.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Back to you, Samana.